Live. My name is Damon. Welcome to Newspaper Liturgy. And this newspaper liturgy stuff is something that I've done a lot in the past, but I now kind of want to do a little bit more of it again and also do it live. And so let's talk about earthquakes, end times, and imperialism. That's what I want to talk about for today's newspaper liturgy, where we talk about stuff happening in the recent news and talk about it kind of from a spiritual perspective, but I'm no conservative Christian, so we're going to talk about it a little bit differently when we talk about the spiritual significance of things. So earthquakes. I'm in California, and an earthquake happened in California. And actually, I was in this last Friday in Santa Barbara when it went down. It wasn't that big of a deal in Santa Barbara. And I live in Santa Maria, but I was at Santa Barbara at my friend's house getting ready to watch season 3 of Stranger Things. And we felt just this kind of wave, this little wave. And it lasted about 5 minutes and then it was done. But actually, I remember when it happened, I thought to myself, I guarantee you that there's a Christian group out there who's like praying, and we're praying that like God would move and it would shake the foundations of people and of the world. And then this earthquake happened. And now they're going to use this story for like months, telling people, you know where that earthquake happened, right? It's because I was in a prayer group and we were praying that God would move, and then he moved. By the way, sorry to the people that it displaced out of their homes, but we did it. The reason I say that is because I've actually been a part of a prayer group when I lived in Orange County where that literally happened, everything I just said. So annoying when Christians do that. But anyway, I also was thinking back to the way earthquakes were talked about growing up in the evangelical environment growing up, especially like I was reading this article earlier in the Los Angeles Times, second quake seen as a sign. And that wording of that headline really reminded me of how I grew up and the way the earthquakes were talked about. All this constant talk of the end times, the second coming of Jesus, the end of the world, the apocalypse, Armageddon, all that stuff, signs of the end times. I was super into Left Behind. I had read all the books, saw the movies, even saw other movies that fictionalized the coming tribulation. Super into it. Looking back, I think a big reason I was into it is because it was probably just my version of science fiction. But I was constantly thinking about it. People were constantly talking about it in my environment. And now I'm not around any evangelicals anymore, really. Not in that environment at all anymore, but I assume people are still talking about it. Actually, growing up, I remember going to certain people's houses and they had those things in the cabinet doors. I forget what they're called, but it's like those things that like make it so that they don't just fly open. And it also makes it really hard to open. And they had all those for the coming earthquake. There have been plenty of evangelical services where they spent the whole time talking about earthquake preparation, because the Bible talks about earthquakes coming when the end times begin. And so let's first off read this article here. Second quake seen as a sign. The seismic 1-2 combo that hit Southern California last week left residents particularly unnerved because it robbed them of the single bit of solace that normally comes with a big quake, the sense that the worst is over. After the magnitude 6.4 quake hit near Ridgecrest on Thursday, many expected aftershocks would gradually decrease in strength and frequency. They'd been through it before in Northridge, Sylmar, and Whittier, but when a much larger magnitude 7.1 temblor struck Friday night, the shock quickly gave way to a newfound dread. What's next? Caltech seismologist Lucy Jones announced an 8 to 9% chance of an even bigger rupture coming within hours and days. So this is kind of scary times. And like I said, I grew up with people constantly talking about earthquakes. Actually, let me mention too, growing up in Santa Maria, I had a pastor that talked about how like According to scientists, I guess where Santa Maria is in California and on the San Andreas um, fault line, apparently it's like Santa Maria is going to be a little bit more safe than other cities, and so apparently it will be kind of a city of refuge. And he took that very seriously, and took that seriously in terms of science, but also in terms of biblical prophecy. And so people are scared. People are wondering, or some conservative evangelical Christians are wondering, is this a sign of the end times? The Bible talks about earthquakes coming and earthquakes getting worse and worse and worse. What's happening? Let's actually look at these biblical prophecies that mention earthquakes. Let's talk about the way that the Bible talks about earthquakes, and let's be honest about it. I'm going to talk about this perhaps a way you haven't heard before, so stick around. So let's first look at Revelation, the book of Revelation. Chapter 16, verse 17. The seventh angel poured his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." And there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a violent earthquake, such as had not occurred since people were upon the earth. So violent was that earthquake. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. God remembered great Babylon and gave her the wine cup of the fury of his wrath. Now, let's point out real quick what it's referring to with Great Babylon. There's a double meaning there. First off, Babylon was the previous empire that had conquered Israel and oppressed them, enslaved them, killed a whole bunch of them. And then Babylon fell, like many empires do, like all empires do. And then came the Roman Empire. And so there were the new empire that was oppressing, enslaving, and killing so many of them. And when they criticized Rome in the Bible, in the New Testament, they would refer to it as Babylon, as in a kind of coded language, but also as a way of saying, here's yet another Babylon doing the same things. So God remembered great Babylon and gave her the wine cup of the fury of his wrath. And I hate when Christians refer to certain scriptures that talk about God's wrath upon sinners. And it's like they also, within that category, include people who just like doing drugs and like having sex and like cheating and lying and saying cuss words. But no, it's not talking about that when it talks about God's wrath on sinful people. It's always talking about actual emperors who led these imperialist regimes that killed and enslaved people. That is who it's talking about when the Bible talks about God's wrath, which is why it says, and God remembered the great Babylon, Babylon that killed so many of us, gave her the wine cup of the fury of his wrath. And every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found, and huge hailstones, each weighing about 100 pounds, dropped from heaven on people until they cursed God for the plague of the hail. So fearful was that plague. Let's also read another bit from Revelation 6, about the 7 seals. When he opened the 6th seal, verse 12, I looked, and there came a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth, the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree drops its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll rolling itself up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. I think it's very important to pay attention to right there, where it's like he mentions all these people before he says, and everyone else. It's important to realize the people he mentions here, the kings, the magnates, the rich and the powerful, and everybody else, hid among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Similar language here. Let's read one more, verse from the Old Testament, because this language is in the Old Testament biblical prophecies as well, talking about their own imperialist powers of their day. Let's look at Haggai real quick, the prophet Haggai. I know my Bible. Some people may think I'm a heretic who doesn't know my Bible, but I know my Bible. Haggai 2, verse 21. I am the God saying to his prophet Haggai, I am about to shake the heavens and the earth and to overthrow the throne of the kingdoms. I am about to destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the nations and overthrow the chariots and their riders, and the horses and their riders shall fall, everyone by the sword of a comrade. On that day, says the Lord of hosts, I will take you. So it's clear here. There's a few big references to earthquakes. When earthquakes are mentioned in biblical prophecies, it's always in the context of talking about how these earthquakes are surrounding events of the overthrowing of these imperialist powers. So if you want to like read this stuff literally as like something that's going to happen in the future, it's like it was their future, but they thought it was going to come really soon, but turned out not, and it's our future. You need to understand this. These scriptures that we're talking about are anti-imperialist prophecies and messages. Most prophecies are anti-imperialist. Imperialism meaning the nation extending their power to foreign lands through military force, aka the highest form of capitalism, because when you privatize and profit off everything, you end up then profiting off of foreign lands through war, aka the thing that most religions started as a reaction against, aka the thing that all Hebrew and Christian prophets warned against. To be a Christian is to be an anti-imperialist. I would even argue to be religious, to be a person of faith, is to be anti-imperialist if you're following these traditions. And here's what's wild, by the way. Here's what's so wild about conservative Christians who are also conservative Christians who are also biblical literalists. If you ask them like why they hate people like Lenin and Stalin and Mao, these communist revolutionaries, they'll say something like, I think it was really horrible of them to overthrow their governments and their leaders through such a violent and bloody revolution, and then to lead these authoritarian dictatorships where they killed everyone that didn't believe in them. And also, if you were to try to say something about if any of those deaths are justified, they would then say, no way any of those deaths are justified. But here's the thing. Here's what's wild. If you ask those same Christians what's going to happen to the world when Jesus comes back, they're going to say something like, Jesus is going to return and overthrow all these leaders of all these nations and establish his rule through removing everyone who doesn't believe in him by throwing them all into hell. And thereafter will be a society where everyone's needs are taken care of and everyone is equal. But he has to throw a bunch of people into gulags first. Sorry, I mean hell first. That's it's like so weird. It's like the truth is that Christians, or these types of Christians, biblical literalists, are actually for the most bloody and violent versions of a plan of communist revolution, as long as Jesus is the one that's leading it. It's ridiculous. And so I personally believe it's pretty irresponsible and dishonest to read the Bible literally. especially when it comes to prophecies in the book of Revelation. It's very dishonest and elementary to read the Bible literally this way. As many people have pointed out, the only people who read the Bible literally are modern fundamentalists and modern atheists, both ignoring the way that Christians have historically read it and ignoring biblical scholars who talk about the style that this stuff was written in. A more honest way of reading these prophecies and all prophecy is reading it as cyclical, something that happens again and again and again. They are warnings to the imperialist powers of their day right in front of them. And these warnings are poetic imaginings of their destruction as retribution for the suffering they cause. But they also serve as a warning against all future imperialist powers thereafter. For example, if Martin Luther King Jr. did say that America is going to be destroyed if they continue to mistreat people the way that they're mistreating people. And if America is destroyed and another nation rises up and they too mistreat groups of people based on their identity, MLK's words will still remain true for them as well. That's how prophecy becomes cyclical. That's what makes something prophecy, is that it was true back then and it is true now. To read prophecy as like just this, somebody had this super clear vision of something that's going to happen way in the future. That's a severe, gross misinterpretation of all biblical prophecies. So horrible. And so, if we're going to assign spiritual significance to earthquakes, because apparently that's what we're doing, let's do it a little bit more honestly and apply spiritual significance to earthquakes the way that these original biblical authors and prophets did, because the people who assign a spiritual significance to earthquakes are doing it because of the Bible. When an earthquake occurred, biblical authors and prophets didn't think about it the way that modern evangelicals do, thinking this is a sign of the soon coming event that Jesus is going to take me away from this world of sinners and then destroy them all. No. For them, when an earthquake occurred, it was a reminder that there are actually greater forces and powers that are more powerful than the imperialist powers right in front of me. The rich, authoritarian, violent oppressors that believe they will be around forever and just get more and more and more powerful can immediately be destroyed by powers greater than it. You can call it God, you can call it nature, you can call it the universe, but we all know deep down that these great and powerful human forces can be taken out like that by things like a great earthquake, a tsunami, or tornado. We all know that imperialist powers always face destruction. No matter how big they get, destruction is always their future. But the power of the natural world, or perhaps you may even be able to say the power of God, always remains. That's how these ancient prophets interpreted earthquakes. So, yeah, that's all I really got to say. Let me know what you thought about this. Let me know what you're thinking about this stuff. Share it if you found it really interesting, and subscribe so you could keep talking about this stuff with me. I love talking about it. So that's all I really got to say. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you in the next video or the next live stream. Let me know if you liked this newspaper liturgy stuff, or you liked me doing this live stuff. If you want to see it more, let me know. All right. See you later. Bye-bye.